So a while ago, the anti-natalist YouTuber Life Sucks made a video critiquing me. I had forgotten about the video, but someone just posted it in my inbox on Discord. And when I saw it, I thought, oh yeah, I remember that. I'm gonna go have a look, because I want to kind of refresh my mind on what the content of this video was. And when I had a skim through it, I was just astounded at how bad the video in fact was. So I thought that I'd make a little response here, explaining some of the problems with Life Sucks' attempted critique of me.
It does not derive.
You're gonna have to stop talking for just a minute. Can you do that? I know that's hard.
Explain to me how an is being derived from an ought.
Okay, great. All right.
So as a medical professional, if a patient is bleeding to death before him, does that not imply that he ought to stop the bleeding? If a cow was tortured and murdered for a steak, does that not imply that we ought to not buy steaks then? I always thought that this was a ridiculous argument. This is really simple logic. I just don't understand how these vegans adhere to silly anti-realist nonsense. I can only assume it's because they are pro-life, and the God thing is so obviously preposterous that as an alternative they have to use word salads and be semantic Nazis to justify an unethical imposition.
So Life Sucks doesn't understand the is-ought problem. It's a problem of logical deduction. How do you move from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion by valid inference? That is, how do you move from is premises to an ought conclusion by valid inference? If you think you have such an inference, let's see it. So he says something like, Avi, you're a medical doctor. Isn't it obvious that if someone's bleeding out in front of you, you ought to save them? Isn't it obvious that if a cow is tortured for steak, you oughtn't buy steak? Well, look, those might be Avi's values. He might value saving the person or not buying the steak, but that in no way implies that he needs or has a valid inference that moves from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion, and it certainly doesn't imply that you do either. So again, if you think you have the inference, let's see it. Then you say, this is basic logic. Well, it's funny because this is a logical problem. It's a problem of deduction, but you don't provide the inference, right? So again, let's see the inference. Then you say this is anti-realist nonsense. Well, that's just hilarious. The is-ought problem isn't to do with realism or anti-realism. It's a problem for both positions. You can be a robust moral realist and not think that you can cross the is-ought gap, right? So again, if you think you have the inference, let's see it. And then finally, you quote Sam Harris, who in his quote does not provide a valid inference that moves from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion. So not really getting the answer there either. And it's also just worth noting on the side, Sam Harris is a notorious misunderstander of the is-ought problem. People who do understand the problem, like Sean Carroll, have attempted to explain it to Sam, but he doesn't seem to get it. I'll link a video down below of Sean Carroll trying to get this through Sam's head. And here's a nice little clip from that video where Carroll explains the problem very concisely.
You are a fan of Hume's parsing of this matter, so perhaps give me the reasons why not from the Hume side, and then we can...
Sure. I think that there's two slightly different claims. One would be the claim that you can derive ought from is, which I think is just manifestly wrong. That's just logically wrong, right? By the rules of logic, garbage in, garbage out. Values in, values out, facts in, facts out. By using the rules of deductive logic, you cannot derive conclusions about properties that did not somehow appear in the axioms or the premises from which you did your logic. So I think that's just a non-starter. I think that is a straightforward computational science claim, that you can't do the logic from there. Now, even if you believe that claim, which everyone should believe, you could still argue about moral realism versus anti-realism. It's totally possible to be a moral realist and a moral objectivist and still admit that you can't derive ought from is.
So yeah, if you think you have a valid inference that moves from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion, then let's see it, and if not, let's see a retraction of this critique.
Suffering is like water pouring out of millions of taps. Another tap is being turned on every 2 seconds. For every 2 seconds, a human being comes into existence. It's not subjective, it's an objective problem. But natalist vegans want to not only keep the taps on, but to turn on more taps and bring more suffering into existence. All because they don't believe in objective value.
Well, there's another basic error by Life Sucks. Obviously, you can be an objectivist natalist, so it doesn't make any sense to say that natalists are such in virtue of not being objectivists, right? What about the objectivist natalists? So unless you think that you can show that that position entails a contradiction, then let's see a retraction of this claim that natalists are such in virtue of not being objectivists.
I never said that it's impossible to hold a dualistic morality, many people do, but rather that such a position lacks consistency and is not a solid foundation for a strict normative system like negative utilitarianism.
Well, if you think that threshold deontology is inconsistent, then derive the contradiction. And if you can't do so, then let's see a retraction of this claim that threshold deontology is inconsistent.
So, as an example of well-being, let's use eating cupcakes. So he thinks that all of the cupcake eating pleasure is not only equal, but of more value than all of the cancer in the world. How is this a justifiable position?
Oh yeah, that's not a straw man of my view or anything. Of course, yeah, the pleasure from cupcakes, that outweighs the suffering from cancer. I mean, I've held that position for years. I'm sure that there's plenty of, quotes of me saying that. I'm sure that Life Sucks didn't just, pull that out of his ass.
Dr. Avi made this graph that I featured in my video about integrity, where on Tuesdays and Thursdays he's going to be a consequentialist, and on Mondays and Wednesdays he's going to be a deontologist. I'm not strawmanning him here, I'm joking because his is a joke of a system. Ask Yourself says that he has a coherent principle that will tell him when to use rules and when to use consequences. So what is this principle? Apparently he plans on doing utilitarian calculus to decide if he should do utilitarian calculus. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, if you think threshold deontology doesn't make any sense, then you could always, give an argument to that effect. That's usually a good thing to do. But yeah, I think that the system is pretty straightforward, and it seems to do a better job of approximating my own values than any other normative system that I'm aware of. So the idea is you place some value on utility, you place some value on rights, and you take both into consideration when evaluating the morality of a given action. So take, for example, the trolley problem. This is a classic, right? There's a trolley on trajectory to hit 5 people. There's a switch that you can flip, and if you do so, then the trolley will be redirected such that it only hits 1 person. So it's a choice between 2 possible worlds. In possible world 1, more people die, but no rights violation occurs. In possible world 2, less people die, but a rights violation occurs. So which is the right decision to make? Flip the switch or don't flip the switch? The utilitarian is going to want to say flip the switch because utility is higher in the possible world where less people die. The deontologist is going to want to say don't flip the switch because a rights violation occurs in the world in which less people die. What would the threshold deontologist say? Well, it depends on their threshold, but the point is that they can give different answers, right? They can say no, don't flip the switch at 5 people, but yes, flip the switch at 10,000 people. So here's a little graph, okay? The D line is deontology, the C line is consequentialism, which for the purpose of this video I'm using interchangeably with utilitarianism, and the T line is threshold deontology. The x-axis is utility and the y-axis is moral value. So going one by one, if you look at the C line, you can see that the moral value, that is the y-coordinate, is negative when utility, the x-coordinate, is negative, is neutral when utility is neutral, and is positive when utility is positive. If you look at the D line, this is for a specific rights violation, let's say murder, you can see that the moral value, again the y-coordinate, is always equally negative regardless of the utility, that is the x-coordinate. And if you look at the T line, it's just the sum of the C line and the D line. To get a sense of the T line, let's just take the trolley problem and vary the amount of people who the trolley's on trajectory to hit. We're not going to vary the amount of people who will be hit if the trolley's redirected. We'll just leave that stable at 1 person. And let's just assign some arbitrary values. We'll say that the wrongness of the rights violation of flipping the switch on someone is -5 moral points. And let's say that the utility of each life saved is 1 util. Those are, again, just arbitrary assignments. So let's say the trolley's on trajectory to hit 1 person. If you don't flip the switch, 1 person dies. If you flip the switch, 1 person dies. So there's no utility difference between those 2 possible worlds, and the utility of the action consequently is 0. And the moral value consequently on utilitarianism is 0. Of course, the moral value on deontology is going to be -5. So the moral value on threshold deontology, 0 plus -5, is going to be -5. It's wrong to flip the switch if the trolley's on trajectory to hit one person. Say it's on trajectory to hit two people. So if you don't flip the switch, two people die. If you flip the switch, one person dies. The utility differential between those two possible worlds is 1. So you're going to have the action having 1 utility point, consequently a value of 1 on consequentialism. And then on deontology, since you're flipping the switch, it's going to have a value of -5. 1 plus -5 is going to give you -4. So it's still wrong on threshold deontology, but not as wrong as flipping the switch when the trolley's on trajectory to hit one person. Obviously, you can see where this is going. Say that it's on trajectory to hit 6 people. So if you don't flip the switch, 6 people die. If you flip the switch, then 1 person dies. The utility differential between those two possible worlds is 5 utils, and consequently the moral value of the action on utilitarianism is 5. When you add the moral wrongness from deontology, which is -5, then you come out to an overall moral value of 0. So it's neutral to flip the switch on threshold deontology when 6 people are on trajectory to be hit by the trolley. And then any number after that, it's actually going to be positive, and increasingly so, to flip the switch on threshold deontology. Also, just as an aside, I'll mention that my deontic impulse isn't really that strong in the trolley case. It's a lot stronger in cases like a rape that maximizes utility. So that's the idea. Seems to make perfect sense to me. Now, if all you want to say is that threshold deontology doesn't approximate your values well, then that's fine. I'd be okay with a criticism like that. But if you want to say the kind of things you've been saying earlier, like that it doesn't make sense or that it's inconsistent, those kind of claims would require arguments. So let's either see an argument to that effect or get a concession that those points were wrong.
Because subjectivism is illogical.
The claims that Life Sucks makes are just so bold, it's amazing. I mean, look, there's reasonable criticisms you could make of subjectivism. You could be like, subjectivism is a theory of public moral language, and it seems to not be tracking how we're using moral language a lot of the time, and then try to give counterexamples to that effect, and then say, therefore, it's not really a good theory. That would be one thing. That could be an interesting discussion. But Life Sucks is saying it's illogical. I mean, I think he's one of those guys who just throws around words like illogical or inconsistent without realizing how bold the claims are that he's making. But look, if you think it's illogical, let's see an argument showing that subjectivism entails a contradiction. Subjectivism is the conjunction of 3 propositions, that moral statements express propositions, that at least one such proposition is true, and that the truth makers for such propositions are people's attitudes. Now, if you can't derive a contradiction, let's see a retraction of that claim that subjectivism is illogical.
There is no well-being, there's only less or more suffering. There are no peaks on the moral landscape, only depressions and valleys of varying depths.
He doesn't realize that he keeps making claims that require him to demonstrate contradiction. Like when he says that threshold deontology is inconsistent or subjectivism is illogical. It's like, what's the argument that either of those positions entail a contradiction? And now he's talking about Sam Harris's moral landscape. So for anyone who hasn't read the book, the idea here is really straightforward. Just picture a 3-dimensional landscape. The horizontal position tells you what possible world you're in, and the vertical position tells you how much utility there is. So if you are talking about the peak of a mountain, you're talking about a possible world that has a lot of utility. If you're talking about the, center of a valley, you're talking about a possible world that has a lot of disutility. Pretty straightforward. So he wants to say, there are no peaks on the moral landscape, only valleys and depressions. So setting aside any kind of cheeky point someone might try to make here, like that, a peak and a valley are mutually implying because they're differences in elevation. You can't create one without creating the other. Even if everything is, below sea level, like in the ocean, there's still peaks and valleys. Setting aside any kind of cheeky point, he's saying that there's no worlds that are peaks, and there's no worlds where the well-being is higher than the suffering. Presumably that's what he means. So what the fuck is the argument for that? Why would someone accept a claim like that? Can you show that it's contradictory to talk about a possible world that has more well-being than suffering, or even a world that has only well-being and no suffering? I don't think so. Now, I'm going to kind of give him a dilemma here, okay? So you can pick your horn. So the one horn is you use the language of well-being and suffering in the same kind of way as everyone else, and you address the critique that I just gave, right? You show that there's a contradiction in positing a possible world that has more well-being than suffering. But on the other hand, because I think he might be trying to do something like this, if he's using language differently than all of us, if he's referring to what we're all referring to as well-being, as suffering, then sure, we can grant that there's no worlds with more well-being than suffering because we've just like eliminated well-being as a concept, but it's no longer going to be the case that suffering is necessarily a bad thing, at least not to most of us, right? Because if the world where I'm a billionaire, everyone lives forever, we can just spend our time like laughing and having fun and like learning about the universe and just being in like transcendental bliss, and I have a Batmobile. Like if that world, he looks at that and he goes, that's like maybe like a -2. It's like, okay, sure, all of the worlds are suffering on your view, but that's just because you're using the word in a different way than us, right? You're just referring to the thing that we'd refer to as well-being as a degree of suffering. So pick your poison. You can have whichever horn of the dilemma you want. If you're using language in the same way as us, then show that it's a contradiction to posit a world with more well-being than suffering. And if you're not using the language in the same way as us and you're just calling everything that we're calling well-being degrees of suffering, then I think most people are just going to not accept that what you're calling suffering is even a bad thing.
Address except for his weird moral objectivism, it's obvious claims, but yes.
Well, it is nice. I will say it is nice to have people concerned about animal rights on all sides of the table, right?
Yes.
Even if there are mortal enemies and meta ethics. It's so obvious, so obviously true that we, should be vegan, that even these insane moral realists
This is a good example of subjectivist habit of making contradictions. He says that animal rights is so obviously true, yet he says moral realism is insane. Well, if that truth is self-evident, then why isn't objective value? It makes no sense. Subjectivists always contradict themselves. It's one of their tells.
Life Sucks clearly has no idea what a contradiction is, and I think it's his general lack of understanding of basic logic, at least in part, that allows him to throw around terms like inconsistent, impossible, or contradictory where they clearly don't belong and couldn't be defended. There's no statement of the form P and not P, which is what a contradiction is, that's entailed by JHC saying that it's obviously true that we should be vegan and moral realism is insane. If I had to guess, I would assume that Life Sucks somehow thinks that the statement it's obviously true that we should be vegan entails the statement that moral realism is true, and then that's how he gets to a contradiction. I mean, that's being charitable and assuming he even knows what a contradiction is on like any level at all. But he'd have to give some argument to that effect, right? Why would we possibly accept a claim like that? It seems obvious that JHC could just be talking from his own perspective, in which case he's just talking about his desires. When he says it's obviously true we should be vegan, he would just mean it's obviously true that I desire for us to be vegan. Or if he's talking more generally about a range of positions, and I think this is actually more probable based on the context, he'd be saying something like, okay, well, there's all these different positions, most of which I don't hold, but they still independently seem to come to the conclusion that we ought be vegan, right? That's not actually him committing to those other positions, right? One of which would be moral realism. He's just stating that all these different positions reach the same conclusion about veganism. So yeah, you have to actually show that some contradiction is entailed there by what JHC said, or retract the claim that he contradicted himself.
What these vegans are doing is denying the existence of value, even though that source of value is what is making their inane, nihilist arguments, their brain. Where there is a brain, there is value. There is your source of objective ethical facts. It's right between your fucking ears.
Well, whether it's reasonable or not to call me a nihilist kind of depends on what you mean by value. So it's not as if I have no concept of what value is. I take value to refer to our desires. If I say that I value that cancer be cured, I'm saying I desire that cancer be cured. But if you're talking about some kind of robustly real notion of value, then yeah, I'm not convinced that something like that exists. And if you are, then you can define what you mean and then provide an argument for its existence. So yeah, that's it for Life Sucks. If he actually wants to defend some of these positions, like if he wants to, pick a proposition that he thinks I'm wrong about, any of the ones in this video would be fine, like about the consistency of threshold deontology or subjectivism, and try to convince me that I'm wrong, then I'm happy to have a discussion with him. He can come by the server. So yeah, we'll see if that happens. That's all for today. If you guys like this content, then support on Patreon. As you all know, I'm starting up school very soon. So, you know, the more dough in the pockets, the closer I move to the world that has still a lot of suffering, but not as much suffering. Okay, till next time.